welcome to the lesson about ATP. Hopefully you just watched the lesson on oxidation and reduction reactions. In our new unit is photosynthesis and respiration, and we're starting with respiration. And respiration, which it occurs in the mitochondria, is how the mitochondria takes the energy that's stored in glucose, and you get glucose from food. Anything that has sugar in it has glucose. And so how the mitochondria takes the energy in glucose and stores it and turns it into ATP, so it can be used by cells. ATP is used in cells to do many things. It's used to build larger molecules, which we're going to see in this slide. It's used to power the contractions of muscles. Every single time you move a muscle, lots and lots of ATP are being used to support the movement in that muscle. And then, as you saw in the unit that we just finished, that ATP is used to transport substance against its concentration gradient in active transport. So essentially in this unit, we're going to see how the mitochondria takes glucose and turns it into ATP. But before we jump into that, we need to learn a little about the structure of ATP and why ATP is a good energy molecule. So this is our good friend, the mitochondria. And in 9th grade, this used to be in 10th grade, now it was 9th grade, now it's going back to 10th grade, you basically learned this about respiration. You learned that the cell takes in glucose and oxygen, and some magic happens in the mitochondria, and the mitochondria turns it into carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. Obviously, in AP Bio, we are going to go into the magic that happens in the mitochondria to make ATP. You need to memorize this reaction. You need to know this reaction, like I said, like it's your ABCs. But again, this presentation goes into the structure of ATP and why it's a good energy molecule. So once again, here's our friend ATP, which we're going to talk more about its structure on the next slide. But the goal of cellular respiration, just like mitosis had a goal of making identical cells, the goal of cellular respiration is to store energy in ATP, which the cell can then use. And again, that energy is coming from glucose. Before we get into the structure of ATP, let's talk a little about sort of like where the energy from ATP comes from. So every single organism on Earth, except for plants and organisms that do photosynthesis, get their energy from organic molecules. Essentially, to simplify it, food, right? So you eat carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, and they give you energy. When you eat them, they go into your stomach and small intestines, and they get broken down and absorbed into your blood, okay? It is then the job of cells, okay, to turn the energy, okay, in those molecules, those broken down molecules, or those building blocks, like at the end of digestion, what essentially you have is the amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein. You have glycerol and fatty acids, which are the building blocks of lipid. You have monosaccharides and lots of glucose. Remember, glucose is a monosaccharide, which are the building blocks of carbohydrates. And then you have nucleotides, which are the building blocks of nucleic acids. At the end of digestion, that's what you have the building blocks. And those molecules go to the cells, where they go into the mitochondria, and it's the job of the mitochondria to turn the energy in these building blocks into ATP. Now, and there's my friend Ralph, saying, whoa, hot stuff. This is the structure of ATP, okay? ATP is composed of 3 phosphate groups, okay? That's where the tri comes from, okay? It's composed of the sugar. Okay, the sugar's name is ribose. Let's see if I can write it with the pointer. So ribose, O-S, it's an S-E. Okay, so that's the sugar ribose. And then the nitrogen base, adenine. Okay, we're going to learn more about nitrogen bases when we talk about DNA. This ATP is actually very similar to the structure of DNA, or DNA nucleotides. Now the question, or the most important answer, is that of these 3 things in the molecule, the 3 phosphate groups, the sugar and the base, where is the energy stored? Okay, the energy is stored in the phosphate-oxygen bond. So the energy is stored here. There's a whole lot of energy in these bonds. Okay, and when those bonds are broken by kinases, remember kinases remove phosphate groups from ATP and give them to other molecules, they release tons of energy. And that energy can be used to power cellular processes like active transport or muscle contraction. Now, the question is, why are these bonds so high in energy? And if you take a look in the phosphate group, we have all these negative charges, okay, from the oxygens, okay? Those negative charges do not like to be next to each other. So when you break this bond, you're relieving this negative charge from the molecule. And the relieving of that negative charge from the molecule releases a lot of energy. So by releasing a phosphate group, you're sort of getting these negative charges away from each other. And that process, or that releases energy. So now the question is, how does ATP release energy? And you saw this when we were doing active transport. But we went to release energy from ATP. One of the phosphate groups is cut off. And that process, which referred to a lot in the test, is called ATP hydrolysis. What happens is ATP releases a phosphate group, and then you're left with ADP. So that reaction is summarized down here. We have adenosine triphosphate, which loses a phosphate group and becomes adenosine triphosphate. And when you do that, the reaction releases energy. Now, reactions that release energy have what they call a negative delta G. This is called Gibbs free energy. It's a chemistry concept. It's another thing we didn't cover in honors chemistry. But basically, it's the energy that's either released by a reaction or absorbed, or basically it's the energy released by a reaction. In order for reactions to occur, the delta G has to be negative. If the delta G is not negative, the reaction will not occur. Okay, now, the energy released by ATP can be used to fuel or give energy to other reactions that require energy. And we also, which we're going to see that in, like, I think it's one of the slides that's big. We're going to see how that works. How do we transfer the energy that's released from turning ATP into ATP? How do we release that? And just to remind you, phosphorylation is when you transfer phosphate groups to other molecules. That's going to come up. You'll see. And remember, the enzyme that does that is called a kinase. So one of the examples of a reaction that requires energy is building polymers from monomers. And if you remember when we learned this in the first unit, this was dehydration synthesis. We need to remove water, if you remember, from the molecules, and that joins them together. This reaction requires positive 4.2 kilocalories of energy per mole per mole of it that you're joining together. So this cannot occur by itself because the delta G here is positive. Okay, this cannot occur by itself. It needs help. Okay, so now the question is, how does the energy from ATP, how does it get transferred to this reaction to help it? Okay, well, if we take a look at the next part of the picture, is that we phosphorylate the molecules that need to do the reaction. If you take a look here, we've added a phosphate group to the yellow carbohydrate. These are two monosaccharides that we're joining together to make a disaccharide. And this destabilizes the molecule. By adding a phosphate group to this sugar, it destabilizes and it wants to react. Okay? So by adding this phosphate group to this molecule, it wants to react. Notice by removing that phosphate group, we turned ATP into ADP. Now, notice that the removing of the phosphate group from ATP and adding it to the sugar was a negative reaction, or it released the energy. Notice that it released more energy than this one. So the energy released here, okay, can be used to power this reaction. And here, remember, the phosphate group destabilizes this molecule. Now it wants to bond to the other monosaccharide, and it does. And you'll see that the overall reaction of bonding two monosaccharides together using the energy from ATP by adding a phosphate group to it and destabilizing the molecule, the overall delta G for the reaction is negative. We got this from adding these two together. And that means the reaction will occur. The reaction was given enough energy to occur. This process, okay, has a name. Okay, it's called energy coupling. Because you're using the energy from ATP, or ATP hydrolysis, to power a reaction that needs energy to occur. So the process is called energy coupling. Also, just a link back to the previous unit, this whole process requires an enzyme to occur. So that helps bring the phosphate group there and stuff and things of that nature. Just to bring it back, this can't occur. These molecules would be unlikely to find each other without the help of an enzyme. So ATP is used quickly in the cell, and it needs to be quickly reformed. So if you see there's sort of like an ATP cycle here. So ATP is used for cellular work, active transport, muscle contraction, all sorts of things that need energy. And then it's turned into ADP. And then we need to take that ADP and turn it back into ATP. And this here, of turning ADP and turning it back into ATP, is the job of respiration, which we're going to be starting to learn on Monday. Energy that needs to be stored is not, for a long time, is not stored in ATP. It's stored in either carbohydrates or fats. So ATP is used quickly. It doesn't last that long. Just an interesting fact, a working muscle, let's say you're running or playing a sport, uses over 10 million ATP per second. Okay? That's a lot of ATP. So you better be eating that glucose, and we'll see also that you better be breathing in that oxygen, otherwise you won't be making 10 million ATP per second to allow your muscles to work. But again, on Monday, we're going to be focusing on how does cellular respiration turn ADP into ATP so it can be used for cellular work. And this process is continuous. Last thing is quickly we're going to go through the structure of the mitochondria. The structure of the mitochondria contains an inner, so this is the inner membrane in red. This is the inner membrane, and you're going to need to draw this because it's not there. So this is the inner membrane and an outer membrane. The outer membrane's in purple here. Okay, so it's a double membrane structure. Okay, and the membrane has inner folds. These folds here, these little folds here and here and here and here and here. Those are called, they're in the inner membrane. Those are called cristae, and their job is to increase its surface area, which you know what that does for cells is that it makes them able to absorb stuff to fill their volume more quickly. So that's going to come play a role in the mitochondria. And last, not inside the inner membrane, we have this liquid area called the mitochondria. Called the matrix. It's been a long day. And the matrix contains enzymes, which the mitochondria needs to do cellular respiration. The only other place that we didn't label is the space between the inner and outer membrane, and that is called the I-N-T-E-R membrane space, and it's abbreviated the IMS. So the space between the two membranes, so it's abbreviated the IMS, the space between the two membranes here, and here, and here, is called the inner membrane space. Okay, that space is going to be very, 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 very important in respiration. Okay, so the space between the inner and outer membrane is called the intermembrane space. The next slide you don't have, but this is what the mitochondria looks like in 3 dimensions. You can see the cristae, you can see the liquid matrix, you can see the inner membrane, and you can see the outer membrane. But that's what it looks like in 3 dimensions, and it looks like a beam to some extent. Alright, well that is the end of the lesson. Go answer the guided questions. I'm going to go grade your tests at some point. Oh my god, forever. And I'll see you guys on Monday.